This is episode 3 of Thicker Than Blood History, and our subject today is like no other. In the immortal words of actor Sam Elliott, sometimes there's a man. And late in the 1930s, there was a man, a 50-year-old man who, like so many others, walked the streets of New York City on various errands of business. But this man in particular stood out for a few notable reasons. For starters, he was about 7 feet tall and weighed somewhere around 300 pounds. He sported a grizzly red beard and walked with a slight limp because concealed beneath his trousers was a wooden peg leg. But perhaps what stood out most about this man was that in the midst of the New York City blizzards, this man wore no coat, no hat, and yet seemed very comfortable in the frigid temperatures. One woman who he came across told him that he had a wonderful beard, and he said with his thick Danish accent, "Oh, you like it?" And he promptly cut off a piece of it and gave it to her as a keepsake. So sometimes there's a man, and this man's name was Peter Freuchen, and he is epic. History is full of stories about people who encounter the worst situations: starvation, war, disease, genocide, the literal four horsemen of the apocalypse. And most people are caught in these moments just as lemmings are in an old game of slave and slave master. Many die, some live, and some just barely survive. But sometimes there's a man who dies hard. Like something out of a movie, we occasionally get these people in history who, in the face of outrageous odds, they live to make the sequel. Some people just have it. Whatever it is, they seem invincible or immovable or imposing. I'm reminded of General George Washington. I've read a bunch of first-hand accounts of him standing on top of a rampart with musket balls whizzing by, some grazing through his coat, and yet there he stands, undaunted, but leaving his men awestruck. Whatever you want to call that quality, Peter Freuchen has got it. He's something of a cross between Indiana Jones and Yukon Cornelius, and like a true Hollywood-esque hero, his countless near-death experiences will keep you, they kept me on the edge of my seat, but deep down, again, like a Hollywood hero, we all know that he's going to survive. We all know that he's going to escape. He'll outsmart the Nazis, he'll get the girl, and he'll live to make the sequel. If you Google Peter Freuchen right now, you'll come across dozens of short articles and quick bullet points of his accomplishments. And without a doubt, the amazing photograph that captured my attention, the one of him donning the polar bear coat with a beautiful woman sitting at his side, it's that image that is the most striking. And he's proclaimed as, they say things like the greatest badass in history, or the man who saved his life with a poop chisel, or a hunter of Nazis. I think I read Tower of Testosterone somewhere. A lot of them call him the real most interesting man in the world. And you'll see his accomplishments. He won an Oscar, he's killed polar bears, killed wolves, he's a friend of the Eskimos, a chivalric Viking who saves damsels in distress. He saved a woman from a crocodile. He saved a woman from a sinking ship. The accomplishments are endless. He's met kings, he's met presidents. He publicly denounces tyrants. There's all these things that add up to who Peter Freuchen is. And unfortunately, it's created something more of a myth than a man. So for my podcast, I've used much of Peter's own written word. That's the primary source material for this. So the next hour or so is heavily reliant on his own quotes and the things that he's actually written. And with his own words, I think you'll find a most profound human being beneath the cheap layers of internet fame. And hopefully you'll learn the true story of the self-proclaimed Vagrant Viking. Lorenz Peter Alfred Freuchen was born the son to a Danish-Jewish businessman on February 2nd, 1886, in the Danish town of Nykøbing Falster. As a child, he would often skip school to spend time seaside listening to the tales and lore of the sailors. Freuchen himself recounted his childhood habit later in his book, Arctic Adventures, quote, "As a child, my inclinations were to follow the sea. My hometown was a sailor's town, and I spent most of my youth on the sea. I owned my first sailboat when I was 8, and had my teachers troubled to look for truants, they would have found me in it." End quote. How many of you have children? Can you imagine your 8-year-old owning and operating their own sailboat? To me, that's free-range parenting in the extreme, although I'm not sure how much his parents actually knew about his youthful adventures. Despite those childhood dangers, he did grow into a young man, and a spirit of practicality and honest obedience to the wishes of his parents kept him landlocked for the time. Young Peter was to be a doctor. He enrolled at the University of Copenhagen to study medicine, where he claimed to be a decent student, but something happened there that was the catalyst for the rest of his life. Quote, "One day while I was working at the hospital, an accident occurred at the docks, and the victim was brought in. For several minutes he had been thought dead. Then a bystander discovered that he was breathing. The poor man was bruised and broken beyond recognition. His skull fractured, his ribs crushed, and his ligaments ripped loose from their moorings. But undeniably, his heart was beating feebly. All the doctors said he would not live. He could not live. They said it then, and they continued to say it for months while he doggedly refused to fulfill their prophecies. 6 months later, his recovery was pronounced complete. It was, everyone said, a miracle of modern medicine and surgery. A human being had been wrought from 3 buckets of blood and flesh and bone. Surgeons flocked to Copenhagen from all over the continent to look at him. He was discussed, examined, and photographed and prodded. Finally, the doctors reluctantly turned him out to the world again. We all watched him go, we all watched him stop at the corner, and then start hesitantly across the street, and we all watched him, as an automobile, one of the first in Copenhagen, ran him down and killed him. That made me burn with an impotent fury. I decided I was not cut out to be a doctor, and I left school immediately." End quote. And so, on June 24th, 1906, at the age of 20, Peter Freuchen, the medical student dropout, joined an expedition to the uncharted Arctic lands of North Greenland. After about a year and a half of exploring, the group built an observation cabin as close to the ice cap as you could possibly get. And the ice cap it's actually just a giant glacier that covers, I think I read, 80% of Greenland, of the island of Greenland. And if you Google Earth it, the ice cap is the giant white mass that's ringed with just a little bit of green around the edges, so it's massive. Anyway, they built a cabin that was necessarily small due to the lack of building material. It measured only 9 by 15 feet. The original idea was for 2 men to stay for a year and make observations of the glacier and continue mapping the area, which is amusing to me because I wonder how much observation a glacier actually needs. The prospective isolation proved to be too terrifying to the explorers. None would volunteer for the year-long post, except for Peter Freuchen. He says, quote, "I was given the choice of returning to the boat or staying out the winter alone. If I stayed, I would not see a human soul, as we were far north of the remotest Eskimo settlement. But I was just past 20, full of a lust for adventures, and, like a fool, I offered to stay out the year alone." End quote. Peter took up his post at the beginning of winter in the Arctic, which means that the sun stays below the horizon for about 6 months. And for 3 of those 6 months, it's total darkness, the rest being sort of a prolonged twilight. When the sun disappeared, the Arctic predators, the wolves of the north, ravenous and starving, they went on the prowl for anything they could eat. And once they discovered there was warm meat inside this tiny little cabin, their stalk began. One by one, they killed all of Freuchen's dogs. He started with 7, and now they were after him. When Peter walked outside in the pitch black, he could hear the snow crunching beneath the footpads of the animals from every direction, but he couldn't see them. There they stalked in the darkness, waiting for any signs of weakness from him. When he was inside the safety of his cabin, he could hear them scampering on the rooftops. The supply sleds that were supposed to come through were mercilessly attacked by the animals, and attacked in pitch black. It sounds horrifying. It reminds me of like being trapped at the bottom of the ocean. And eventually the supplies stopped coming through altogether. They were unable to contend with the wild packs of wolves. And so in the northern isolation, it was just Peter and the wolf. But he finally had enough of the wolves, and so he set a trap on the roof, and he tied it to a chain, and he led the chain through an air hole in the ceiling of his cabin. And when a wolf prowled above and got caught in the trap, he secured the chain inside the cabin, crawled outside, and shot them. "The plan worked beautifully," he said, "and I killed him, but this was hardly sufficient revenge for my dead dogs." End quote. But this clever trap wasn't the only weapon Peter had against the canine menace. Quote, "One day while I was on the mountainside, I approached a huge rock, which I always used for a landmark. As I was about to pass it, a wolf that had evidently been asleep behind it jumped to his feet and yawned. I was in such terror that I leapt off the trail and dropped backwards over the cliff. Fortunately for me, I landed in a snowdrift, but it was a miracle that I did not kill myself, or, at best, break a leg and be left to the questionable mercy of the wolves. But I have a God-given gift which I had never appreciated before, and no one else has appreciated since. I love to sing, and my voice is so terrible that no living thing, not even a wolf, can endure it.
From the day I made my discovery, I never stepped out the door unless I was singing at the top of my lungs. I went up and down the mountainside, shouting out my joy in life over the snow in the Arctic night. The wolves were defeated. They tried hard enough, but they were just no match for me. In fact, I can truthfully say that I made a living with my voice, a statement which nobody who knows me would ever believe." End quote. He'd found the wolves' weakness, but now his greatest threat in his solitude was his solitude. And the walls were quite literally closing in on him. Freuchen writes that the condensation from his breath began to accumulate as ice sheets over the walls and the ceiling, slowly entombing him and adding to his mental deterioration. Quote, "Finally, just before the Arctic dawn, the ice became so thick inside my cabin that I could no longer stretch out on the ledge which I used for a bed. With no fuel left, I was in a miserable shape, crawling up and down the mountain each day in what seemed to be more like a dream than reality. In my little hut, I gave names to the different utensils, and often found myself babbling to my tea kettle and to the pots and pans." End quote. Despite his temporary insanity, Peter Freuchen survived his year-long hermitage and the extreme isolation and predation. But some of his companions on other missions were less fortunate. Many of them died. One man, starving and near death, dragged himself to a food cache, but was so weak that he couldn't open the door and died within an arm's reach of sustenance. Reflecting on his first adventure, Peter says, quote, "For me, it had been an initiation into my future life, and it added to science more specimens and information of the Arctic than any other had secured. The price had been the lives of 3 of our comrades. We left our harbor after building a large cairn to the memory of Mylius Eriksson, Lieutenant Hagen, and Jorgen Brunlund, who had given their lives. Our reception at Copenhagen was heartwarming. We managed to arrive on a Sunday forenoon so that the crowd could get a good look at us. The king, the prime minister, and the heads of universities greeted us. And for days we were tendered lavish banquets and interviewed by the press. And yet, there soon came a day when we were no longer news to anybody, and we had to adjust ourselves to routine work again. We scattered all over the country, and I have not seen many of my companions since then." End quote. Attempting to rejoin civilization, Freuchen tried to return to his intellectual studies, but found them frivolous and boring. And so he found work in writing novels, and he got a job at a newspaper as a journalist. And he began touring Denmark, giving lectures about the frozen north. It was in this lecture circuit that he met a fellow Arctic explorer who would later become his best friend, a man named Knud Rasmussen. Knud was part Inuit, which is the proper term for Eskimos, and he was raised among the Inuit children. He lived for the snow and the cold and the ice and the dog sleds. He had a passion for every bit of it. And to illustrate the type of man that Knud was, Peter Freuchen recounts the following incident while the two were hunting narwhals on one of their many adventures. Quote, "When the whale dived, it pulled the line attached to the bladder around Knud's body, capsized the kayak, and hurled him into the water. He was an excellent swimmer, but the line was twisted about him, and he disappeared below the surface in the wake of the wounded narwhal. The rest of us sat in our kayaks, absolutely helpless. For once I knew what it meant to feel my blood run cold. After an interminable interval, Knud came up far away, gasping for help. We rowed frantically, but long before any of us reached the spot where he had appeared, he was down a second time. I was afraid he was done for this time. But a second later, he bobbed up again. This time he stayed up, and we hauled him out of the water. Not for a moment had he lost his nerve. He had merely hung onto the bladder, he said, as he figured his weight would quickly tire the narwhal, and the animal would come to the surface. You'd better go home for a change of clothes, I said. He eyed me reproachfully. Don't you see that this is our chance for a big killing? Later on, I asked him if he at least did not want his clothes wrung out. Why, he said. Because you're wet as hell, I roared. By God, I forgot that, shouted Knud. That's the kind of man who makes a real explorer. End quote. Peter and Knud traveled together, giving lectures about the Arctic and the Inuit cultures that inhabited those frozen lands. There's some amusing stories about Peter fumbling with the projector. At some point during their lecture circus, Knud pitched an idea to Peter. He proposed, under the auspices of the Danish king, they sail to Greenland and establish a trading colony in the northernmost inhabited location on the planet. Peter Freuchen recounts the proposal. Quote, I thought about it for several days. I had myself to think of and my own future. I realized that I had an equal opportunity with other young men to make a living in the civilized world. I might complete my studies and become a doctor, or I could become a sailor. I might, since I had made a start, make a name for myself as a newspaperman. I might do any number of prosaic things, but I decided against all these possibilities. The spirit of adventure was my heritage. My grandfather, somewhat of a roamer himself, had implanted in me traditions for seeking out the strange and the different. I told Knud I would go with him, and I have never regretted my decision. End quote. After securing funding for the transportation, Peter and Knud landed in the North Star Bay, an area on the northwest coast of Greenland. They built a small house which would serve as the foundation for their fledgling colony, which they named Thule. Fox pelts were the primary commodity of Thule, but it would also serve as a launch pad for any scientific explorations to map the wild north. The reception by the Inuit was very warm as Knud's reputation preceded him, and Peter was quickly endeared to them. Quote, "I soon became acquainted with a number of these wonderful people who were to be my lifelong friends. Not once I had ever had any reason to distrust them. They had already received a fine impression of white men through their dealings with that great educator, Admiral Robert Perry, and had learned much from him." End quote. One of Peter Freuchen's early excursions from Thule was during the winter when the sun was gone, and in this blackness he became separated from his Eskimo companion, Asayuk, in the cold and the dark. Suddenly he felt his dog sled jerk to one side, and then to the other. The ice was thin and fresh, and only a small pan of it was keeping the sled afloat. The dog's feet were sticking to the new ice, and they were exhausted, and he was lost and stranded and in mortal danger in, no doubt, the absolute remotest place on Earth. Peter describes the situation, quote, "I had no way of knowing how long I stayed there, but at last I could bear it no longer and decided upon a desperate plan, to cut the dogs loose so that they could save themselves, and then with my harpoon try to walk out on the thin ice. This would have been certain suicide, and I was saved from it by the long and despairing wail of a distant dog. I figured that the sound had come from one of the other teams. I answered by pulling in one of my dogs and beating him until he whined, and his teammates let out a ululation of sympathy which could be heard for miles in the calm night. Then I listened attentively. After a few moments, there was an answering howl. The exercise had sent blood coursing through my legs and arms again. I felt better. It was something to know that another human being was somewhere about, even if we could not come closer to each other. Again, I tried the ice with my harpoon, but it broke through. If the ice cannot support the weight of a harpoon, it is not ready for a man. After what seemed to be hours, I saw a tiny flare in the darkness, the light of a match, but I could not answer it. Again, I swore because I did not smoke and carried no matches. I saw 6 matches flare and die, and I could only beat a dog each time and try and make myself heard. But I received no answer, and the signals ceased. More than anything, I wanted to hear a voice, but the only sound was the crashing of the ice pans as they were thrown together by the currents below us, currents which might send us all to hell at any moment. More hours passed, and I almost lost the spirit the sight of the matches had given me. My only consolation was in knowing that someone else was in the same predicament as myself, and that helped a little. And then, from far off, I heard a shout. I eased myself to my feet and answered. I yelled louder. Nothing happened. Then I heard the voice again. Apparently the man was trying to explain something to me, but I did not understand Eskimo any too well, and his voice was almost drowned in the voice of the sea. I sat down again. From time to time I stood up and shouted, and sometimes received an answer, sometimes not. Evidently he slept as fitfully as I did. Finally it seemed to me that his voice was a little louder, and I screamed until my throat contracted. I had not breath enough to keep up this constant bellowing, but I was so excited that I could not sleep any more. Several more hours passed, and at last I could distinctly hear the voice shouting, the voice of my friend, Asayuk. "I am coming," he said. How this message warmed me, and yet it took many hours before he came near. Finally, he was within talking distance, and I knew the reason. He was in the same state as myself. I yelled, "How is it then that you are coming nearer to me?" "I am drifting," he said. Fortune then, and not any of our efforts, was bringing us together. We could hear ice crashing all around us, but we did not care much. Asayuk told me that he had been in the water, but he was not seriously wet. Then I thought I could see him, but I must have been mistaken, for he said he could not yet see me. He asked me to light a match, and I told him that I had none. He decided that he would sacrifice his last matches and let me try to walk over to him. I was to tie my harpoon to my leg, and thus have a means of returning to my sledge. It worked as we had planned, and the ice did not crack beneath me now. But I could not see Asayuk when I was at the end of my line. I added my whip to the harpoon line, and from the end of this, I could just make out his dogs, and I dared drop my guiding line and struggle out to reach him. He assured me that we could easily find my tracks back to the sledge, as it would be daylight soon, by which he meant a dull red glare on the horizon to the south, against which it was possible for a few hours to see the silhouette of a man. As I sat waiting, I realized that already I had spent almost 24 hours on the ice. I had not eaten a single meal, nor drunk anything, and added to this, it was Christmas Day. End quote. Peter obviously survived this terrifying ordeal, and he learned a lot about the realities in the Arctic in the process. Back in Thule, where he was warming up and getting his strength back, he received a letter from a girl back home in Denmark who he had been courting. The letter stated that she was coming up to visit him with the summer's resupply ship, Quote, "She wanted to share my life, whatever it was. She wanted to live in my house, wherever it was, and become an Arctic woman. Together we would make life gayer and pleasanter than it had ever been anywhere in the world." End quote. But when the ship arrived, she was not on it. And Peter writes that he understood it was too much to expect of her, and yet heavy weighs the broken heart of a young man. Quote, "How empty my little preparations for her arrival. How much more empty the house than it had been before. My life loomed ahead of me like a river meandering aimlessly through a barren desert, and I had, in a sense, to reshape it in unexpected channels. But I was still young, and my life had been an exceptionally clean one. In Denmark, I had lived mostly with my parents, and since then I had been too busy to get into any trouble. My mother and father had instilled in all of us a sense of our position, and taught us that the world and its evil ways were not for us. As a sailor, the filth and horror of the harbors had been repellent, and had kept me away from loose women. I suppose I had dreamt of saving myself for a pure girl, and now her failing me seemed especially ironic. She had, I was convinced, ruined my life." End quote. In this environment, perhaps Peter was looking for romance in the wrong place. He had living with him a newlywed Eskimo husband and wife as house guests. For whatever reason, they had no place to live at the moment. The husband was clearly losing interest in his wife. Peter says his extended hunting trips got longer and longer, and eventually he said he was going on a hunting trip and did not know how long he would be gone for. To avoid any talk of scandal when the husband was away, a young woman from the village would visit while the house guest's wife was home with Peter. He described how this young village woman lightened every room she entered and made everyone laugh along with her, that everyone was happy to have her around, and Peter was obviously falling for her. One night she arrived, but Peter's housemate was absent, and so she thought she should go. But Peter suggested she stay with him, and at that request he said her eyes were eloquent and spoke the language every girl knows, regardless of race or clime. He says, quote, "I only asked her to move from the opposite side of the ledge over to mine. That was all the wedding necessary in this land of innocence." End quote. He recounts the village's reaction to their marriage, quote, "Next day she wanted to know whether she was to return to her home or not, and when I said no, that was final. A few hours later, one of her brothers came to ask why she had not come home. She said, 'Somebody is occupied by sewing for oneself in this house.' The boy was startled, but said nothing, and he turned on his heel to race from house to house with the news. After a few hours, sledges hurried north and south to tell what had happened and to hear firsthand of the comments of the neighbors. Again, I was amazed at the discretion of these wonderful people. Not one of them spoke a word to either of us, which would indicate that the girl had not always been living in our house. Visitors came as usual and talked as if she had been my wife for years, and they had been her guests many times." End quote. This girl, Freuchen's lovely new wife, was named Navarana. The Eskimos' attention to politeness and etiquette stands out. They never allowed themselves to potentially embarrass anyone. It was just part of their culture. Peter one time was scolded because he kept asking people if they needed help with various tasks, and finally another Eskimo pulled him aside and said, "We don't ask each other if they need help. Here, we just help each other. It's expected. But if you ask if one needs help, you're implying that they are incapable, and that may embarrass them and ruin their reputation." Navarana, Peter's new wife, despite her sunny disposition, had lived a life, as Freuchen says, was a blood-curdling saga of the Arctic. When she was a child, her small island community was killed off by some unknown disease. Only her little brother, and her mother remained. When the food ran out, they ate the dogs, and when the dog meat ran out, they ate their shoes and sled traces. When her mother's milk ran out, her little brother bit off the mother's nipple in panic. Navarana's mother apparently could not endure her son's misery and starvation, and so she hanged him to end his suffering. Navarana told her mother that she did not want to die and would rather remain to comfort her mother, and so she survived on grass and rabbit droppings until another Eskimo visited the island and adopted Navarana as his stepdaughter. This contrast of Navarana's buoyant and sweet personality compared with the brutality of her childhood is, to me, a triumph of the human spirit. On one of their first excursions as husband and wife, they were driving their sled and came upon literal thin ice. Peter asked Navarana if she was afraid, to which she said, quote, "Is a woman afraid when she is driving with her husband? Doesn't she trust her worries to him?" End quote. Peter wouldn't admit it to her, but he was quite afraid himself, and he was having trouble getting the dogs to muster the energy to continue, and I'll let him recount what happens next. Quote, "We should have been down on the other side long since, so I said, 'Let's go back. These dogs can't take the load across.' "You don't want to turn back," exclaimed Navarana, "and admit to the people that we could not cross and listen to their laughter. The women will make fun of me for not getting where we wanted to go. I do not like to hear that." "To hell with the women's kidding," I shouted. "You can see for yourself that the dogs can't drag the sledge along." She looked up at me shyly, as if afraid to say what she knew she must. "It is not possible that maybe something could be done to make them try it," she said. "What would that be? Show me what you suggest." She mumbled something and asked me not to think badly of her. Then she took my whip and started for the dogs. They perked up at this new voice of authority, and instantly Navarana had them to their feet. She was a fury turned loose. From the shy, sweet little thing a moment ago, she was transformed into a mad witch. The crack of the whip was like the ice breaking. Her voice echoed over the ice caps, and the dogs leapt to their traces. Away from the merciless lash they tore, the load as nothing to them. The animals instinctively knew that authority was in the hands of a person who knew how to command. We dashed toward the highest point of the passage as if we were on the heels of a bear. So fast did we go that I could hardly keep up with the sledge, and I looked with admiration at my little wife, with the big whip in her hand. She was more beautiful than ever, and I forgot everything in my awe of her. When we reached the top, she halted the dogs and handed me the whip, saying, "They only felt ashamed because they were driven by a poor woman, and hurried so that they might not be offended any more." I knew that I had coddled my dogs too much, but I told her that in my country we did not use dogs for hauling, and it was difficult to learn to drive them. She explained that she had gone hunting often with her grandfather, and she had learned to drive from him. "Don't tell anybody," she warned, "that I took the whip while driving with you. I do not want the women to say my husband is not the best dog driver in the country." What the women would or would not say for a long while was our court of last appeal. End quote. With Thule more established now as a trading base, Peter and Canute could now use it as their launching pad for their mapping explorations. Their first exploration would be their most famous. One of their fellow explorers, Einar Mikkelsen, had gone missing on a journey to the somewhat mythical realm of the northern Greenland coast. Canute and Peter went in search of him. Over the course of several weeks and several hundred miles, they trekked into the northernmost point of Greenland, known as Perryland. Perryland was previously assumed to be an island separated by a channel called Perry Channel, but as Freuchen and Canute found out, there was no channel. Perryland, turns out, is a peninsula. In this time of Arctic exploration, this was considered a major discovery because it changed maps that had existed based on Perry's exploration from earlier. They later discovered that Mikkelsen had indeed been there, but he had moved on. Canute and Peter barely survived the trek. Starvation and thirst, of course, were expected complications, but snow blindness, something that I had no idea existed, was another threat. It apparently occurs when the sun's UV rays burn the retina of your eyes. Peter Freuchen suffered from snow blindness for most of the trek. He describes it like sandpaper on your eyeballs. While on their way home, as they approached their beloved Thule, the fondness of friendship between Canute and Peter after the harrowing journey became apparent. Quote, "We called a halt and waited for Udlavariak to explore the crevasse between us and home. And when I sat there, Canute walked over to me and gave me his hand. Many times during the summer, he said, I didn't believe we could go on. But now that we have completed such an expedition together, we ought never to be apart again. Wherever we go in the whole world, we must always stick together." I believe that neither Canute or I realized exactly what we had accomplished in the crossing of the ice cap. We had begun our expedition with a casual and humanitarian motive of rescuing a countryman, Einar Mikkelsen. We had not found him or any sign of him, but in our search we had made many important discoveries and observations, proved the non-existence of Perry Channel, and accomplished the feat of traversing the northern Greenland ice cap, something no man had ever done before. End quote. Peter and Canute, flushed with their monumental achievement, decided to make a trip to their homeland of Denmark to proclaim their victory. About halfway between Greenland and Denmark is an obscure archipelago of islands called the Faroe Islands. These Nordic Gaelic people, so far removed from mainland Europe, preserved a way of life that makes visitors feel like they've traveled through time. Peter recounts his experience in profound poeticism. Quote, "Faroe is the one place in the world where the tradition of the old Vikings still lives. The ancient dances, as executed by knights and their ladies, have come down through the centuries unchanged. The old songs, the endless ballads are still sung as accompaniment to the dances. The same verses are chanted over and over. The same long rows weave in and out of the complicated figures. They are fascinating to watch for a while. The lovely girls, with their long yellow tresses, their fresh complexions, and beautiful open smiles are incomparable. Life is dangerous on the sea, and in the mountains where they must go for birds and eggs. Only a strong, virile people will be able to endure the climate, let alone wrest a living from the scant resources of the island, half-hidden dots on the surface of the sea. Yet, the girls who toil endlessly in the daytime at grueling physical labor are utterly feminine in the evenings, sweet and guileless, devoted to their traditional songs and dances, and the very epitome of courtesy and grace." End quote. Upon returning home and reuniting with Navarana, Peter found that Americans were now utilizing their trading post of Thule. He was at first apprehensive about their arrival, but they quickly impressed him. Quote, "At any rate, I corrected my earlier impressions of Americans as rather wild men whose favorite pastime was training horses and shooting off revolvers in saloons." End quote. But more importantly than Americans arriving at Thule was the news of war. World War I had just begun. The guns of August were ablaze. Peter and Canute and all who heard the news of this great war, they all felt quite confident that the European powers would be completely exhausted within 3 months and the war would be over soon. Yet, for Peter, there was even bigger news than the world at war. Navarana was pregnant with their first child. And even after 9 long months of pregnancy, his wife's labor still hit him like a ton of bricks. Quote, "In the middle of the night, she came home complaining of a stomach ache. We thought it nothing more important than eating too much matic, and she went into the other room to sleep. A few hours later, Arnanguak, who still lived in our house, came to meet me with the news that Navarana's time had come. She was going to give birth to her child. I was frightened half out of my wits. I had realized, of course, that this moment would arrive sooner or later, but we had not known when the baby was due. I cried to Arnanguak to look out for Navarana, and I bolted out to call Canute. He came running out of his tent and was as bewildered as I. But anyway, he said, he had 2 children and was therefore an authority. I know that when Han was born, we made coffee and had plenty of it. Let's go for water. They will need hot water too. So we went for the water, as I knew it would be a long while before the actual birth took place. Each of us carrying a pail, we walked to the brook, doing the one thing we knew would be of help. When we returned, the boy was already born. I had to let everyone know at once, and I ran shouting from tent to tent. Everyone was interested. Everyone is interested in anything in the Arctic, but not very excited, I thought. So I ran to the house where Dr. Hovey and the other white men slept. They made it plain that this news could well have waited until the morning. Captain Comer alone got up and dressed and sat over coffee with Canute and me. Navarana was sleepy, she said, after having drunk a cup of coffee too, and there was nothing more for us to do. As a matter of fact, a father at the delivery of his son is not the most necessary person in the world. It is true that he does not suffer much physically, but his pride and his importance is dealt a severe blow. And so, after a while, we went to sleep again. The boy had been born at 3 a.m., June 16th, 1916. End quote. And they named him Mekosak, after his great-grandfather. Any parents of toddlers listening know how tireless toddlers are, and Eskimo toddlers apparently are no different. Quote, "Every household has its own problems. Ours was Mekosak's habit of crawling up and playing instead of sleeping. To prevent this, he was told that a great ferocious bear walked up and down beside us during the night and looked for small boys who were not asleep. If the boys did not sleep, they were likely to have their heads bitten off. As we slept in the cave for some time while the gale continued to blow outside, the boy grew restless and crawled up to take a peek outside the bag. Imagine his consternation when he actually saw a bear standing close to him with a very ominous look in his eye. The child hurried back to his place with such alacrity that his mother was awakened. After she had seen that he was comfortable once more, she too looked about and saw the bear standing beside us. 'Peter,' she whispered hoarsely, 'there's a big bear right in the cave with us.' There was no doubt about it. There was a bear, and he was between me and my gun. I yelled and jumped out of my bag. Now, a naked man is not much of a fighter in a temperature of 40 below, so I grabbed my pants from underneath the sleeping bag and stepped into them while I rose to my feet. In my nervousness, I put both feet into one leg. At the same moment, I noticed Etukasunaguak was up and had his gun ready, but he could not shoot without endangering us, so I began to run. That is inconvenient with both one's feet in one leg of his trousers. And I toppled forward and rolled down the slope to the feet of the bear. He was as frightened as I was, and he leapt away from the thunderbolt that was after him. The dogs had been attracted by the noise, and a number of them tore loose from their traces and attacked the intruder. Itukunasagwak was now free to shoot and did so, but killed his best dog before he succeeded in getting the bear. Mekosak was so thrilled by the performance and laughed loudly when he saw his father lying between the paws of the bear. Navarana brought him down to toss his little spear against the dead bear so that he might get his share. He had been the first to sight the animal, and she was so proud of him as if he had made the catch single-handedly." End quote. It wasn't much later that Navarana was pregnant again, and she gave birth to their daughter, Pipaluk. With a wife and 2 children now, Peter had decided that he would show them what life was like in the civilized world. The civilized world, at this point in time, was in the process of butchering an entire generation of European men by way of toxic gas and industrialized firepower, the likes of which humanity had never seen before. The once lush green fields of France, now a web of trenches and showered with endless artillery bombardment, and they had come to resemble the surface of the moon, only drenched in young men's blood. By the time Freuchen's family reached neutral Denmark, some 15 million people were already dead from the war that was supposed to only last 3 months. During their visit, they had an audience with the king of Denmark, who asked Navarana what she thought of Denmark. Peter recounts the moment, quote, "Navarana turned to me. Is that man really the king we have heard so much about? How can he think for everybody in Denmark if he is stupid enough to suppose that I have any opinions about this magnificent land after only 1 day's stay?" "What does she say?" asked the mighty man. I translated freely. "Your Majesty, she thinks it wonderful and grand." "I thought so," said the king, and was content. End quote. Even though they were safe from the war that was ravaging Europe, there was another killer lurking about, one that would soon claim twice as many victims as the war. Some 50 million people would soon be dead from the Spanish flu epidemic. The Spanish flu was like the second coming of the bubonic plague. It tore through national borders and rapidly crossed oceans. Once caught, an infected person would hemorrhage from the nose, mouth, ears, intestines, and lungs. Secondary infections and pneumonia would take a hold, and the patient would either die or barely survive, weakened and laid low for months or even years. It's estimated that 6% of the world's population was exterminated by the Spanish flu. Indigenous people suffered even more horrid death rates. Some villages ceased to exist within a few months. While in Denmark, Peter caught the Spanish flu, and after months of bedridden agony, he barely pulled through. Now recovered from the flu and done with Denmark, his family returned to Thule and began to make preparations with Nud for a new adventure into the Hudson Bay, and Navarana was to go with them. They had left Pipaluk, their daughter, with Peter's parents back in Denmark for the time, and Mekwasak was going to stay in Thule with a missionary. Peter and Navarana met at a small town called Upernavik, the furthest north civilized town in Greenland. Its population was mostly Inuit people who took to the white man's ways. There it became evident Navarana had contracted the Spanish flu. She quickly became bedridden and was fading in and out of consciousness. Quote, "She lay still for a long while. Then she took my hand in hers and told me how happy she had been in having a husband who would talk with her as an equal. And finally she said that she was very sleepy. I went into the kitchen to brew tea for her. As I sat and watched the water, it came over me how much I loved her, and how much she had developed since our marriage. Navarana was so quiet that I tiptoed in to look at her, and as I watched, her lip just quivered. Then she was dead. I would not believe it. I had somehow never thought of the illness as much more than a bad cold. My dear little wife was dead. I sat petrified. For the first time in my life, I was in the presence of the death of someone close to me. My past life had been happy and carefree, and suddenly I found myself the father of 2 motherless children. I had taken Navarada out of her natural life and surroundings. I hoped that she had been recompensed for what she had lost, but who knows? She was the bravest little girl who ever lived, and never would have complained about anything that came her way." End quote. After her death, the minister of Upernavik, who Peter describes as an undersized native imbecile, he told Peter that because Navarana had died a pagan, there would be no church bells, no sermon, and no Christian burial. So, against the minister's wishes, and as there was little he could do to stop the Viking giant, Peter dug Navarana's grave in the church cemetery himself. Peter and Canute continued to the Hudson Bay despite the death of Navarana, and they were even wearing garments prepared for them by Navarana. At one point, Peter found himself alone, away from camp, and he and his sled dogs were caught in a blinding snowstorm. So Peter took shelter under his sled and fell asleep. When he awoke, he found that the snow had accumulated around him and entombed him in like an icy mausoleum. He tried lifting his sled, but it was frozen solid in the snow pile. What Peter claims he did next, some might say brilliant, some might call it something else, but he apparently moved his bowels and fashioned a chisel out of his own excrement. And once this new tool was as solid as ice, he hacked his way out of his would-be grave, but he soon found he couldn't walk. One of his legs was frozen and useless from the knee down. By the time he crawled back to camp, the gangrene and decay was so bad on that foot that he could see the bloody bones of his toes. Knowing them to be done for, he grabbed a pair of pliers and a hammer and began removing all 5 bony digits from his foot. Limping from his lack of toes and back in Denmark now, Peter reconnected with an old acquaintance from his days of giving lectures. Her name was Magdalene Vang Lauritsen, and she was an heiress to the largest margarine business in the country of Denmark. Her father was also the director of Denmark's National Bank. In 1924, they were married and settled down in Copenhagen. So back again in the civilized world, Peter needed employment. And since he had newspaper experience, he found a job as a reporter for a left-wing political journal called Politiken. He was also given the position of editor-in-chief for his wife's family's magazine, though they were more interested in his name more than his talents, which infuriated Freuchen. To make matters worse, he was finding that he and Magdalene were vastly different people with different ideas of success in marriage. And just as Peter was sinking into a feeling of dissatisfaction with life in Copenhagen, it became clear that his left leg needed to be amputated. Peter was so sick of the close quarters of the city and prying neighbors, and he was appalled that his wife slept until noon and needed to take Italian vacations to recover from the exhaustion of doing nothing all day. And now the loss of his leg all but guaranteed there would be no more precious Arctic adventures. Quote, "The operation left me terribly depressed. I felt as if my life was over. My spiritual pain was far worse than my physical suffering before the amputation. All the sympathy I got did not make matters any better. Telegrams and letters from all over the country arrived every day. The king sent flowers, cabinet ministers called on me, and people even had kind words to say about my former life in Greenland, probably in the belief that I was through once and for all." End quote. Just as the doctors were starting to seriously worry about Freuchen's depression, he found purpose in the presence of other amputees. Quote, "One day my doctor invited me to spend the morning in his office and observe his patients. I saw a procession of armless people pass through the room, all with various complaints. The last was an old fanner who had lost his left arm. 'How are you doing?' the doctor asked. 'Splendidly,' the man answered. 'Why shouldn't I?' 'Well, the loss of an arm must be a handicap in your work.' 'Why? There is nothing keeping me from my work. My right arm is as good as ever.' 'But you can manage as well as before?' asked the doctor. 'Certainly. I must admit I get annoyed sometimes during the harvest time. I used to be the fastest man on the farm, but now there's a young fellow who beats me. Otherwise, I'm as good as ever.' When the farmer had left, I expressed my gratitude to the doctor. The wise man had his special reason for asking me to watch his patients. They made me realize that it is not the handicap that counts, but the man. From that moment, I improved rapidly. I did not feel sick anymore, and I refused to regard myself as a helpless invalid." End quote. With his spirits back, Peter Freuchen began writing novels, all based on his adventures in the Arctic. It was about this time Peter had also purchased his own private island, and this private island, just off the coast of Denmark, served as the perfect place for him to sit down in solitude and do his writing. It was his temple of solace for him. Evermore, it was a place that he longed for, no matter where he was. Peter had the opportunity to travel to Soviet Russia to give lectures on the Eskimo Society, which the Communist Party hailed as great propaganda. He also began receiving contracts from the German film industry for movie scripts, and one contract was for a conservative publisher that was advocating to bring the Kaiser Wilhelm back from exile. Peter says, quote, "My life was getting slightly complicated. In addition to my contract with this conservative undertaking, I was a member of the staff of the radical newspaper Politiken. I had been put up as a candidate for parliament by the Social Democratic Party, and in Leningrad, they were still distributing my translated lectures on the Eskimos." End quote. Freuchen was now internationally famous and making a substantial living from his writing. He found himself rubbing shoulders with multimillionaires and even the President of the United States. Eventually, Hollywood purchased the rights to one of Freuchen's novels called Eskimo, and he was at once whisked off to Los Angeles as an advisor for the film, and he and the film crew traveled to northern Alaska to commence filming. What ensued was a hilarious clash of Hollywood starlets and hard Eskimo life. The female stars refused to play an Eskimo that didn't have makeup on. Everyone complained of the cold, and Peter was the only one who knew how to communicate with the indigenous extras and also build igloos for the set, which they needed for the movie. He spent much time living amongst the Eskimos there and avoided his crew at all costs. He almost never made it back, however, from the filming. The plane chartered to carry Freuchen and a chef and 2 actresses crashed in the ice of Alaska. Freuchen himself navigated their way back to civilization through the ice and the snow, where they chartered another plane, and that one also crashed in the ice. But eventually they made it back to California, and he found his Hollywood contract unrenewed, much to his satisfaction. He decided before flying back to Denmark that with the sudden spare time he had, he would take the opportunity to drive across America and see the countryside. During his trip, he picked up a hitchhiker who claimed to be an associate of Al Capone, because things like that just happen to the real most interesting man in the world. It was around this time Peter learned of Knud Rasmussen's death. Quote, Knud and I had spent 14 years together in the Arctic, and the world seemed empty without him. He had been something of a hero and an example to me. I had always needed his praise and his criticism above all. I had probably been too dependent on him, but I later realized I had grown more independent during the 2 years I was away. At the moment, however, I had only the sense of a tragic loss. Freuchen's movie Eskimo was being released all over the world, and he was due to attend the premiere in Germany. Shortly after he entered Germany, he reconnected with some family he had there who, through their great wealth, offered to arrange an audience with the new leader of the country, a man named Adolf Hitler. Peter replied, quote, I had not the slightest interest in meeting the man, nor would my newspaper want me to interview him. End quote. His stay in Germany was a short one, as Nazi uniforms were everywhere in 1934, and Peter couldn't bear the sight of them. After Germany, he made a brief trip to South America and had many small adventures, almost getting arrested for possessing shrunken heads and sharing a cab with someone who was later found murdered. In the red light district, he bought a poor prostitute dinner and paid her fee but refused her services. In another incident, in pure Freuchen fashion, he leapt into crocodile-infested waters to rescue a woman who had the unfortunate luck of jumping and landing on top of one of the giant reptiles. Peg leg and all, he saved her life. Passing through Germany yet again on his way back home from the southern hemisphere, Peter became aware of the Jewish exiles leaving the country. And without any permission from his own government, he began to take in those who were forced out by the rising Nazi party, allowing them temporary residence on his private island. Quote, These people were not always easy to handle once they were safely settled at Einho. They disagreed about everything except their common hatred of Hitler and the Nazis. We had some Trotskyists and some Stalinists acting like cats and dogs. We had one syndicalist and one pacifist. There was one girl who belonged to the oldest profession, and the daughter of a German millionaire. This last specimen was particularly tough on me. She wanted me to marry her. Once the Nazis were done for, her father would pay me 1,000,000 marks if I would do what she asked, and she would pay Magda whatever she wanted for the sacrifice. If she were legally given my name, she could get a passport and go to the United States and start divorce proceedings. As soon as her divorce was final, I could remarry Magda. The proposal seemed quite natural to her. She could not understand why I did not grab at this chance to become a millionaire. End quote. As time went on, Freuchen began publicly condemning Germany over rumors of concentration camps. And with him being such a prominent Danish citizen, he was chosen to be part of a group that would be allowed access to Germany to see with their own eyes that such camps did not exist. The group, however, was quickly thrown out of Germany when Freuchen refused to sign a paper recanting his prior criticisms of Hitler. Next, his book tours took him again to Soviet Russia, where he was an official guest of the government. There, he was presented with the opportunity to join an excursion to Siberia aboard a ship called the Molotov. And along the way, he was met with the peculiar idiosyncrasies of the Soviet people at the time, such as conversations going silent as soon as any complaints about the state rose up. His luggage was confiscated from time to time, never to be returned. His acquaintances mysteriously disappeared without a trace. There were outlandish claims of Soviet ingenuity, such as the subway system being invented by Stalin's own mind, and that no other country in the world had subways. Freuchen's own interpreter, after enjoying a bottle of vodka, admitted that he was placed as a spy and had been reporting all his movements and actions back to Moscow. But the spy said not to worry, as all the reports were positive. On multiple occasions, Peter was threatened with arrest for asking too many questions and successfully arrested for spending too much time in a bookstore. All this with repeated assurances from his various acquaintances in Russia that nobody goes missing in Russia because they have the best police in the world, and nobody steals in Russia because there's no capitalist among them. But of all the offenses against the proud Viking's dignity, none match the offenses caused by the infestation of bedbugs throughout the whole nation. He says from Moscow to Siberia drove him crazy for the whole trip. In Siberia, their ship the Molotov attempted to ferry a couple of lumber barges out of the icy waters. The rescue was a complete disaster, and most of the people on the barges died as they crashed into the ice and began to sink. Ladders and ropes were dropped for the barge crews to climb aboard the Molotov. The last person left on the sinking barge was a woman too scared to reach for the ladder. Peter Freuchen, embodying chivalry despite his peg leg, climbed down and tied her to a rope and allowed her to be lifted to safety. But he was now the last person aboard the sinking barge. They threw the rope to him once, and it missed. The second one, and it missed. And finally, the third time he caught the rope, tied himself up, and was saved. The Molotov continued its Arctic quest, but was in pitiful shape, and eventually it completely broke down just north of Japan. A Soviet tugboat had to be sent to the rescue, and when it arrived, it crashed right into the Molotov. And after much hardship at sea, Peter and his Soviet guide secured a train on the Trans-Siberian Railway back to Moscow. But even this was interrupted when the train crashed headlong into another train. Fortunately for Peter, he was in the fifth car and unhurt. So now aboard another train on their way back to Moscow, it was time for the Russian elections, and Freuchen's train stopped so that everyone could get out and vote. And naturally, in this election, 100% of the people happened to vote for Stalin. Men and women around him were weeping at the display of national solidarity. And shortly after the election results came back, Peter saw another train pass by, with car after car hauling loads of prisoners in the opposite direction to Siberia, their eyes glaring at him from behind the little slits. Those people were off to the gulags, off to their death, condemned by kangaroo courts to join the miserable millions, never to be heard from again. Freuchen, as an official guest of the government, barely made it out of the Soviet Union. During his excursions in Siberia, his passport had expired, and the one man who could have helped him renew it had been declared a Trotskyist and sent to die in the gulags. And after much struggle and great worry, he was eventually able to secure a new passport from the Danish government. In preparation to leave, he was shadowed by a Soviet interpreter who watched his every move, but Peter had already agreed to meet an English journalist who was unable to leave the country and wanted to get a letter out to his wife, who didn't know if the man was dead or alive. So Freuchen managed to lose his spy. He met the Englishman, and at great risk, he stuffed the man's note inside his hollow wooden leg and got it out of the country. He made it back to Copenhagen, quite happy never to be an official guest of Russia again, and even more happy to be free of bedbugs. So Peter was back at his beloved home, but the world was in the process of being turned upside down. Hitler had invaded Austria, and thus more and more refugees were coming ashore on Peter's small island. He never turned a single one away, and amidst the chaos of his refugee camp, he was still able to find solace there. Quote, "Every morning I got up at 4 o'clock and began my day by walking around my island, watching the seagulls come to life and seeing the darkness gradually dissolve. It was quite dark at that early hour in January, but I knew every tree and bush and stone. I went to the stables where the animals were beginning to stir. Every morning I wondered anew at the miracle of growth, of life stirring everywhere around me. When the men on the farm began their day, I had completed my survey of my domain. I breakfasted with them and gave them their instructions and settled down in my small house, the old smithy which had been turned into my workshop. This was the framework of my peaceful existence in those days, of calm before the storm, but I was always ready for the unexpected." End quote. That fall, Hitler invaded Poland, and the unrivaled slaughter of World War II commenced. 6 months later, Peter recounts what he saw from his island. Quote, "The last melancholy days of early spring were spent straightening out my affairs. One evening, April 8th, I went on my usual evening walk when I saw a startling sight. A fleet of ships, more than I had ever seen, were steaming north through the strait, freighters and warships, small and large. I was puzzled and concerned and forgot my own little worries. As the sky turned darker, I became aware of a heavy thunder which increased rapidly. Soon it was all around and above us, an armada of warplanes flying to the north. This must be more than maneuvers. A large-scale attack against England, I thought, as I went to bed with a heavy heart. In the morning, the telephone was out of order. I was going to row across and make a complaint when the little mail boat arrived. People Luke went to fetch the mail and came running back from the beach with terrifying news. Denmark had been attacked. The Germans had landed at Gedser and had moved north. There had been some local fighting during the night. A few hundred Danes had been killed. There was confusion everywhere. Nobody knew what had happened, but later in the morning, we heard the tragic proclamation from the king. There would be no resistance against the overpowering enemy. There was nothing little Denmark could do." End quote. Peter Freuchen went to bed in Denmark, and woke up in Nazi Germany. And even though the King of Denmark officially declared there was to be no resistance, these people are the descendants of Vikings, and not destined to be a conquered nation. Remarkably, Peter managed to smuggle the refugees off of his island into Sweden to keep them out of the hands of the Nazis. He promptly sold his island to the highest bidder so that he could move back to Copenhagen to live with his wife, Magdalena, in a new house they purchased. She hated the island anyway and rarely visited. His son, Mekwasak, stayed behind with the new owner as a hired hand, and Pepaluk went with her father. During the Nazi occupation, 3 men stopped by the Freuchen residence with an offer to cut down one of his trees so that he may burn it for fuel, since now even firewood was being rationed. And in exchange, they could keep some of the firewood for themselves. Peter agreed, and he even helped to cut the tree down with them. During their conversation, he discovered it was all a pretext, and that they were actually British spies. They needed to arrange hideouts for British agents that were to be parachuted behind enemy lines. Peter Freuchen enthusiastically offered his help. It wasn't long before Peter had helped covertly import several British agents, as well as machine guns, time bombs, and other interesting material, as he puts it. He also used his nationwide speaking engagements to act as an underground courier between the various resistant groups, carrying not only messages but also explosives. Soon, Danish factories working exclusively for the enemy began blowing up. Danish converts to the Nazi party and German nationalists began turning up dead. And Peter just kept giving his lectures. Quote, "All my life, I had been used to speaking my mind without any serious thought of consequences. But this habit of not guarding my tongue was a great handicap during the war. I learned to be careful, but sometimes I was sorely tempted. In my own suburb of Birkerød, the Danish Nazis organized a camp for its youth movement, and we were constantly exposed to the sight of these traitors marching and singing all over the neighborhood. It was less depressing than we expected, since the recruits were mostly mentally retarded or juvenile delinquent, but their presence was most objectionable, particularly on the commuter trains. They were loud-voiced and abusive, and I seemed to be their favorite target. There was lawlessness everywhere. Irresponsible persons conducted their own private kind of warfare in the most irregular way. I still remember the day when 2 of my group went off to Odense one morning on a private errand. They left at 8 o'clock, arrived in Odense at noon, and went straight from the station to a small grocery store. The owner was alone behind the counter, and without a word, they shot and killed him, and returned to the station. They were met by their local contact, who told them that the storekeeper was loyal. It was his son they were supposed to kill. All right, there's still time enough for a small matter of murder before they had to catch their train back home. They returned to the store, killed the son, and caught their train." End quote. For any Tolkien fans out there, this sounds eerily like the Scourging of the Shire. Peaceful little Denmark is overrun by an indomitable evil, and it all becomes more wretched as a consequence. Freuchen helped derail freight cars, and he added sugar to cement mixes, rendering it useless. All in all, he and his group remained a constant annoyance to the Nazi occupation. Some underground agents were double-crossed, however, and exposed, and shot on sight. Peter himself had a few near misses. Quote, "My lecture tours brought me into contact with a great variety of people, some of them decidedly unpleasant. Crossing on the ferry to Jutland one day, I ran into a man I used to know at the airport in Copenhagen in his pilot days. Now he was dressed in a German uniform and sat in the restaurant in the company of 2 German officers. He called out a greeting as I passed, but I pretended not to hear him. He ran out on the deck after me. 'So, you don't know me anymore, is that it?' he shouted. 'Am I not good enough for you?' 'No, you certainly are not,' I assured him. 'I'll make you change your mind,' he warned me. 'I shall see to it. You are already well known.' 'Yes, but fortunately not for the same reason that you are,' I retorted, and added a few words which made him rush back to his officer friends to have me arrested as a saboteur. I ran down to the car deck and tried to hide among the vehicles. They had not discovered me before we landed, so I explained my situation to one of the car owners. He took me in his car, let me lie on the floor, and covered me with a blanket. As we left the ferry, his wife and daughter sat in the back seat with their feet on my broad back, and nobody bothered us. The response was always the same whenever I asked for outside assistance." End quote. It must be a strange kind of anger to see your own countrymen, people you've known for years, turn against their own people. Once the Nazis began their long-expected roundup of the 9,000 Jews in Denmark, the underground miraculously managed to smuggle 7,000 of the 9 out of the country. But Peter's subversive activities eventually caught up with him. Quote, I was at home in Berkerad preparing to leave for Samso when my telephone rang early one morning, and a friend warned me that the Gestapo was on its way to arrest me. My telephone was still being tapped, and his message was picked up. Within a few minutes, the Gestapo arrested him. I thought at once of escape, but I saw through my windows that the house was guarded. I made sure I had no incriminating material in my desk and sat down to wait for the Gestapo. 2 officers arrived shortly, one of them a native of Schleswig who spoke Danish fluently. He told me I was under arrest and would be shot if I attempted to escape. End quote. Peter, now a prisoner, and his fellow prisoners, they entertained themselves by giving lectures about various areas of their expertise. Little did he know that his fellow brothers in the underground were already working on his release. They had arranged a false air raid siren that sent the Nazi brutes running for cover out of the prison. Moments later, dynamite blew a gaping hole into Freuchen's cell, and, peg leg and all, he escaped the grip of the Gestapo. Peter promptly went into hiding among the underground agents, and soon learned that his daughter, Pipaluke, was also soon to be arrested for her own illegal activities, a woman after her father's heart. Fortunately, the underground found her first and brought her to her father. But Peter was found again by the Germans and recaptured. Quote, "The following days were not those I want to remember. I was cross-examined for hours. I was beaten, and my artificial leg was taken away. The officers fired questions at me and slapped me constantly across my face with wet towels. They were enraged when they got nothing out of me, and the silliest trifles made them wild. I began pretending not to understand German. At first they believed me since they had not yet found out who I was. Once my identity was established, they screamed that I had lectured in German all over Das Vaterland and could speak the language all right. I replied that I had forgotten it and was rewarded with another beating. The Gestapo told me gleefully over and over that I could not possibly avoid execution for all my evil acts." End quote. Peter was sent straight away to the Danish prisoner camp, where he awaited transfer to a more formal concentration camp in the heart of Germany. He says, quote, "Before any arrangements had been made for our transfer to the south, I received a serious warning from the outside. My case was coming up for a final trial, and there was no doubt about my fate. I had to escape. My friends made the necessary preparations from outside, while I chose the simplest way out. Leaving the barracks at night, crossing the yard, and climbing a fence proved unexpectedly easy. The Germans were demoralized, and the guards were obviously relaxed. My friends waited for me at the appointed spot on the other side of the fence and took me down to Copenhagen harbor, where a fishing boat bound for Sweden was waiting. Shortly after my escape, several of my fellow prisoners were released, but in most cases the German magnanimity proved to be a deliberate fraud. They let loose a number of people against whom they had no evidence, but once outside the prison, they were shot while, quote, resisting arrest. My friend Billo met his death that way. He was released and returned to his home in Elsinore. When he had been at home for a few days, the doorbell rang early one morning. His wife opened the door and screamed when she saw the Gestapo outside. Billo ran to the door to investigate. The Germans shot and killed him instantly. A friend of ours from the same camp was warned in time that he was to be shot, but he could not escape. He got into a kayak to row across to Sweden, but was discovered by a German Coast Guard vessel and shot through the head." End quote. Soon Peter and Pipaluke were smuggled out of Denmark into neutral Sweden. From there, Peter continued his underground work against the Nazi invaders as a courier between the Allies and the underground. Peter's wife, Magdalena, was arrested in Denmark, but eventually managed to escape to Sweden as well. But she was already pretty mentally fragile, and this whole experience had left her worse off than before. She told Peter that he was too much of a vagrant for her nerves, and thus they mutually agreed to a divorce. Soon Peter was asked by the American government to go on a lecture tour in the United States about Denmark's contribution to the war. On tour, he became acquainted with an elegant woman who had lost her husband in the war in the Pacific. Her name was Dagmar Mueller, and she had made a name for herself as a New York fashion magazine editor. They were soon married and settled down on an island off the coast of Connecticut that lived in old world fashion. No mail delivery, no running water, and they loved it. Like Peter's island in Denmark, this American island seemed to be the antidote that the Vagrant Viking needed. This island is where he would spend the rest of his life. A few years after Peter and Dagmar settled down, he and his daughter, Pipaluke, decided to travel back to the Arctic, back to Thule, to visit their old friends from so long ago. Thule, however, had changed a bit. The small town he founded was currently being transformed into the United States' most northern Air Force base, and still is to this day. Peter says, quote, "We visited all the familiar places along the coast, Sukkertoppen, Gotthab, Holzenborg, and I was received by all the Danish officials as a prehistoric animal. I could have made a book out of the fantastic stories they told me of my early years in Greenland. Most of their tales were about some incredible adventure I could no longer recognize as myself. It was a strange feeling to meet myself as a character from the Greenland sagas. Our return to Thule was a great experience for both of us in more ways than one. As we passed Cape Atoll and approached my old home, the radio operator handed me a message from the State Department through the American Consul in Gotthab. Any landing on the American side of New Thule Harbor would be disapproved. I did not protest, although it seemed strange that I, a Dane, should be refused entrance to any part of Greenland, particularly to a settlement which I had founded, and which did not even have a name until Canute and I decided to call it Thule. But I stayed away and spent my time visiting all my old friends in Thule. My old home is no longer a remote spot outside civilization. It is a stopover on the main air routes of the world. I cannot help remembering that I gave the place its name as I think back on the happy days I spent there. I built the first house in Thule. Now I drove in an American car on paved highways. I saw road signs. I heard explosions from the distance where construction workers were busy removing a mountain. And behind this American city, I looked over at the second highest structure in the world, an observation tower for the Weather Service, more than 1,200 feet high. A road was being built across the inland ice to the east coast. Once Canute and I had made the trip in 19 days, a record that will never be beaten, not by dog sleds. Today, the shining cars are rushing across the ice cap, 10 cars in a caravan, driving for 20 hours. The men eat in their luxurious trailers as they drive. They sleep in comfortable berths, in places where Canute and I risked our lives with our Eskimo friends. I thought of the poetry of progress, the splendor of men conquering a nature considered invincible. I thought of the men who died in Melville Bay, and I thought of the Black Mountain which was always there to guide us in the bay. How many times I had looked at this landmark, how many times I had hated the dark hostile mountain which was always so far away. When the snow was deep and the dogs were tired, when the ice seemed impassable under a cold hard moon, and lack of food sapped all one's strength. Black Mountain was always there, always as far as ever. Time and time I had forced myself not to look up, not to watch the distant landmark before I felt it must have moved closer. When hours had gone by, after a whole day's painful march, the distant goal was as far away as ever, but I had learned to ignore it, to keep going after the distant goal, never to give up. My friends had seen me come to Thule as a young man. They had seen me marry, had seen my wife, Navarana, bear children. We had all been tossed by the winds of fate. Navarana, my wife, had found her grave in Greenland. My children were far away. They had grown up in Thule. There they had waited while Navarana and I were gone, sometimes for days, sometimes for months. But we always returned to Thule. That was my home, and it always will be, even if the people move. The wind blows, and the world moves on. It rolls over 300 Eskimos, their tents, and their igloos. They do not complain. We go farther north, said Odark. New men have moved in. They know not the old ways. They have little peace or dignity. They have taken the land, but our land is great, and we move on. And we know that you are a wise man, Pita. One day you will see that there is less happiness in the land of white man. We are happy because you came to us, Pita. And we are happy because one day you will come back. Do you remember when you first came to Thule, Pita? I fed your dogs, and I fed them well. Today meat is put on scales, and every morsel is weighed. No longer does a man know how to chase a bear or catch a fish. He waits for the fish to come by itself and swallow a lazy hook. I have never caught any fish but the salmon I stabbed with my spear. Yes, life is a journey, as my wise friend Odark told me. We are being punished because we have stayed too long in one place, Pita. Life is a journey without end. End quote. In 1957, Peter Freuchen died of a heart attack at the age of 71 at his home in Connecticut. In his final book, The Book of the Seven Seas, he filled the pages with a gripping narrative of the history of the high seas, from their primordial foundations all the way to mankind's explorations, naval battles, and sailor lore. Reading it, I felt very much like a young boy, enchanted by the stories of an old sea captain who lived in a world that no longer existed, and I yearned for it. 3 days before Peter died, he wrote down the foreword to his Book of the Seven Seas, and I think the last published words by Peter Freuchen are the best close to this story. Quote, "When the gales whip trees and rattle our windows, or snow piles up outside so that no one wants to go for a walk, Landlubbers snug in warm rooms are likely to tell each other how sorry they feel for the poor sailors on a night like this. But they feel, too, a little wistful envy of the men who brave the cold storms upon the restless water. The stories which these fellows bring to us are the stuff our dreams are made of. We may not believe the tellers of the salty tales for a minute, but in our secret minds we live them. We are all great heroes in our dreams. We drift endlessly in hot, dead calms, while all on board but us are in despair. We baffle the most violent storms, conquer the bravest fighters, foil the most bloodthirsty pirates, bring home the richest cargoes from the most amazing voyages, wrestle with monsters, dive for sunken gold, see the strangest sights. Then in the end, science takes over from our imagination, and behold, there are even greater wonders than we dreamed.
Research for these podcasts is often its own reward, and for this one in particular, I was so profoundly affected by the research. I crammed 3 of Freuchen's books into about a month of reading, and they were so enrapturing that it was more of a desire than a task. I couldn't wait to get home from work and get my hands back on these books. The sheer wealth of information that was available between the 3 of them, he's got a lot more than 3. 3 is just what I read, but the sheer wealth made editing this episode a really painful task, because I really wanted to keep it down to about an hour. I think that's a really useful time frame, preferably less than an hour. But like I said, there was just so much information to draw from this guy that it was, and not only that, his writing is just so good. It's so emotional. And so pulling that all down into an hour was just really, really tough. And then he himself is just such a striking figure, even if you're not looking at the amazing photographs of him. But the juxtaposition of, the 7-foot-tall peg-leg polar bear killing Viking against this eloquent and emotional writing, I think it offers a picture of a man so unique that you can't help but be impressed by him. If you enjoyed the story and you're up for a few laughs, Peter Freuchen, this is something I left out of the podcast, but he was actually on the old game show, the $64,000 question, and he won it. The subject was the high seas, and he nailed every single question. Most of that, I haven't been able to find the footage of it, but if you go onto YouTube and you search Peter Freuchen, there's a clip of him answering some of the questions, and it's just awesome. It's perfect. And also, I highly recommend reading his books. There's just so much to learn from this guy. He's got a lot of books that are in Danish, so if you can speak Danish, then by all means. So, as always, I always like to close saying thank you. I really appreciate you listening. I sincerely hope that you were able to take something away from the amazing life of Peter Freuchen. If you could, I'd really appreciate you sharing this episode with friends and family, and most of all, giving the show a rating and review on iTunes. That seems to go the farthest, so that we can continue growing the audience for Thicker Than Blood history. Thanks a lot.